Hello and welcome to the National D-Day Memorials April Lunchbox Lecture. My name is John Long. I am the Director of Education here at the National D-Day Memorial. And let me start by inviting you to come by sometime and take a look if you haven't been in a while. If nothing else, this is the most spectacular time of the year to visit our memorial before it gets really hot and humid in the summer or really miserably cold in the winter. The spring and the fall also just great times to visit, to see the site, enjoy the natural environment. We're getting ready to complete our nature trail that circumnavigates the entire memorial grounds, and that will be dedicated later on this spring. Uh, it's always a great time just to be outdoors this time of year, and this is a great place to be outdoors. So I invite you certainly to come by. And more importantly, this is the 80th anniversary year of D-Day. So it's a great year to visit and to think about the importance of this event that we commemorate every single day here at the memorial. But another thing that we commemorate is my subject today. If the National D-Day Memorial is known for a project, a research project that uh, has made a difference and that is unique in the world, it is our necrology project, where we have done everything we can to identify every Allied soldier, sailor, airman, Coast Guardsman from any Allied nation who fell on D-Day. And that is my subject for today, to talk about that project. I think most of you watching probably pretty well familiar with the National D-Day Memorial, already somewhat familiar with the Necrology Project, but you may not know how it evolved, how it works, how it's continually changing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of that as we go along. But I'm going to start my talk with two guys in particular whose names are on our wall. This gentleman right here was Sergeant John Unkin, and I want you to picture him on a landing craft on the morning of D-Day, but not at dawn, about 2 hours before, heading for a couple of islands off of the coast of Utah Beach, known as the Saint Marcouf Islands, or the Ile de Saint Marcouf. You have to. I don't speak enough French to pronounce that properly, I'm sure, but they are a few miles off of Utah Beach, visible from Utah Beach on a clear day, and really somewhat unremarkable. Today, they're nature preserves. Really, nobody ever goes there. But once upon a time, they had boasted a Napoleonic fortress. And in 1944, the problem was no one really knew what was on the Saint Marcouf Islands. Finding out is part of the mission of John Unkin. Meanwhile, while you picture John on landing craft shivering in the chilly sea air, not far away was another soldier, a private Anton Elvisator. And again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that's my best guess. And he is also heading for the islands as part of the 24th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, whereas John Onken was in the 4th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. And I presume they didn't know each other since they were in separate squadrons. But if they had ever met, they would have found out they had a great deal in common. Elvisator was Norwegian by birth. John Onken was German by birth. Both of them had immigrated to the United States. Elvisator with his family, John Onken pretty much with himself and his brother. John Onken's family is still in Nazi Germany on June 6, 1944, his mother and his sister. And I kind of picture him having a little bit of trepidation as he heads toward those islands, because he is going to France, and France is where his father had died. His father had been killed as a soldier in the German army in the First World War and was buried in a cemetery in France. But think of their mindset as they're getting ready to lead off this seaborne invasion on D-Day. They are, of course, apprehensive about what's on those islands, what is waiting for us. Are we going into battle? Can I do my duty? Will I, stand up to the pressures of and show the courage that I've been trained to? But imagine them also thinking about their family in occupied Norway, in Germany under Nazi domination. And as they're coming to do their part to liberate Europe, you can imagine that they are, again, just highly interested, because more than a lot of the American-born soldiers, they know what this invasion is about. They are heading to these islands, these tiny little islands, only one part of a giant campaign, but they are going for reasons that they understood very well. They are liberating their homelands in at least some sense. And so as they head to the St. Marcouf Islands, they would find out that those islands were not occupied by any Germans. There had been Germans there earlier, but on the morning of June 6th, none were on the island. However, when they visited before, they had left behind an unpleasant surprise: fields of landmines. And sadly, neither John Oncken or Anton Elvisator got very far into French territory. They, at some point in the day, we can't easily know which one first or how far into June 6th this happened, but both of them were killed by landmines there on the St. Marcouf Islands. They were almost certainly the first two American fatalities in the seaborne invasion on June 6, 1944. Some Americans had already been killed as paratroopers in the airborne invasion, but the seaborne invasion, these two guys were probably the first to fall for the American Army. And so their sacrifice certainly made a difference, and their example certainly deserves to be remembered. One thing neither of them could have ever guessed is that their names would have ended up on brass plaques on a curved wall in a place called Bedford, Virginia, many years later. But they are two of the American names on our memorial wall. So, what is that wall? Why is it here? How did it start? What does it accomplish? Well, I've already used the term necrology a couple of times. I should probably define that for anyone not familiar with the term, because this is often called the Necrology Project, and the wall is often called the Necrology Wall, sometimes the Memorial Wall, sometimes just the wall, as you're giving a tour of the site. But necrology, the term necrology, is a term for a list of the dead from a single day or a single event. So if you tried to look up the number of people killed on the Titanic, that would be a necrology of that shipwreck. So the necrology at the D-Day Memorial is the list of all the known dead from the invasion on June 6th, 1944. And the idea goes back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, before the memorial was even officially open. The board of directors for the National D-Day Memorial Foundation set a challenging goal that I think when they first considered it, thought, that sounds like it could work. We want to identify all the men who fell on D-Day, and we're going to hire a researcher to kind of head up this project. And so in the late 1990s, the National D-Day Memorial Foundation hired, let me find my buttons here. There's the memorial, of course, but hired Carol Tuckweiler, the person you see in the photos here, as the researcher to look into this question: who died on D-Day? What are their names? And how many of them are there? Now, I think for the initial planners who said, let's try this and see what happens, I think I kind of picture them assuming it was pretty easy. There's got to be a roster out there somewhere. It can't be very hard to figure out who there are. What Carol quickly found out, she was a retired librarian from Roanoke, and incidentally, personal friend of mine back then. I knew her when she was working for the library system in Roanoke, and I have stayed in contact with her ever since. But what Carol discovered about this idea is that it was anything but a simple question, and finding an incontrovertible answer to it proved to be absolutely perplexing, because what she discovered was there was no roster of the D-Day fallen. She would have to create it. And furthermore, there wasn't even a good estimate of how many names she should be looking for. If we knew that exactly 12 men had died on D-Day, finding those 12 names wouldn't be very hard, and you would know to stop at 12. You wouldn't go on looking for 13. But she knew we were talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of names, and there was no telling where the end point was. The estimates of the D-Day fallen had varied widely, and really at that point were no more than guesses. One of the probably the best early source, wasn't the first book written about D-Day, but the one most people associate is, of course, Cornelius Ryan's excellent seminal history of D-Day, written in 1959, called The Longest Day. And I certainly recommend that movie or that book and the movie that came from it to anyone interested in D-Day if you haven't seen it or haven't seen it in a while, because it's highly enjoyable. But he said in his book, quote, over the years, a variety of vague and contradictory figures have been given on the losses sustained by Allied troops during the 24-hour period of the assault. In other words, Cornelius Ryan, who at that point in 1959 almost certainly could be considered the world's greatest expert on the history of D-Day, he said, how many people died? No one knows. And even so, he cited initial reports of fatalities from the U.S. First Army, or in other words, the American Landing Force, as exactly 1,465 died on D-Day. Okay, that's a good start, I suppose. But again, there was no consensus on that. In 1964, 20th anniversary of D-Day, President Eisenhower, former President Eisenhower, and of course former Supreme Allied Commander on D-Day, Dwight David Eisenhower, was interviewed by Walter Cronkite in France, and it's really a very interesting perspective on D-Day. It's still on YouTube if you ever want to look it up. But Eisenhower and Cronkite, in this interview, Eisenhower mentioned 2,000 casualties in this interview. So 2,000 was his answer. And then Stephen Ambrose, the next really big, exhaustive, although not infallible, I'll add, there are a few errors in there, but next big history of D-Day was Stephen Ambrose, 1994 book called D-Day, which is also wonderful. It's a great starting point. As I say, there are a few errors, but if you're just starting to read about D-Day, you're probably not going to pick those up. So I am very quick to recommend Stephen Ambrose's book, and really any of his books, because they're just thoroughly enjoyable. But he said in the book D-Day in 1994, quote, no exact figures are possible for D-Day alone. In other words, his answer was the same one Cornelius Ryan had given in 1959. Nobody knows. And it's also worth noting, by the way, that both Ambrose and Eisenhower in 1964 used the term casualties, not fatalities. And there is a difference in military parlance, a casualty is any man who's been killed, captured, or wounded or missing. In other words, any man who's incapable of being in the fight the next day. That's a casualty. A fatality is obviously a man who has been killed. So when we talk about the number of casualties on D-Day, there really is no good number for that when you start looking at the number of wounded and such. But it sets a different standard than Carol was looking for. Her job was fatalities, find the men who had been killed on D-Day, and that was a job that from the beginning she realized was going to be a lot harder than was originally envisioned. And so she found this a very daunting task, but she is determined, if anything. And Carol plowed ahead looking for the best answer to the question she could come up with. And one of the first questions she asked herself was, how do you even start? Who should I talk to? Who would be an authority? And she came up with the answer. How about the director of mortuary affairs at nearby Camp Lee, Camp Greg Adams today, but Camp Lee back then, who obviously would know something about men who died in the service and how the records were kept. And so she called up this individual at Fort Lee and asked, and this is the way Carol tells the story, quote, after explaining to him that I was researching the names of all members of the Allied Expeditionary Force who lost their lives on D-Day, June 6, 1944, his initial response was, you can't do that. Why not? I asked, thinking there must be a security problem with accessing the records. Because it's never been done before, he continued. I know it hasn't, Carol said. That's why I'm doing it. No, you don't understand, he said. There is no single place where you can find the list of names of people who died on a particular day. That's the answer she got from the very beginning. And I think a lot of people would have been discouraged and just gone back to the board of directors and said, you've asked an impossible job, and I'm not capable of doing it. But Carol, again, very determined, very resolute, very good researcher. So again, she plowed ahead. She discovered that this official was certainly right. There was no single place to look. So next she began to compile a list of different places where she would have to look. It was easy at the beginning. She just had to walk a little bit up the street to where the Bedford County Courthouse is, and there is a stone memorial there with the names of all of the Bedford fallen in the Normandy campaign, not just on D-Day, incidentally, but she could get those names pretty easily, the Bedford Boys, as they're now known. And then the second place was pretty obvious to start looking, the Normandy American Cemetery, where burial lists certainly provided a lot of her initial names for the project. But not all D-Day fatalities lie there in that cemetery, and not everyone in that cemetery was a D-Day fatality. So men are buried there for for weeks and weeks. But and then many of the men who had fallen on D-Day were buried in other cemeteries in France, or as you may know, at the end of World War II, families had the option to bring their fallen son, brother, husband back to the United States for burial. And so many of them may have been in one of the French cemeteries once, but now are here in the United States. And that added more complexity because there was no list of those people either. And so she had to keep digging. She had to look at after action reports. She had to scour ship logs, unit reports, morning reports. I'll talk a little bit more about those in a bit. Headstone applications, because of course, if you fall in the service of the United States military, you can apply for a headstone that to mark your grave. And so headstone applications, hometown obituaries, missing air crew reports for the airmen, all these and many other primary sources she had to painstakingly hunt down and search for men who had died in France on June 6th, 1944. Excuse me, pollen time of year. So she had to learn something about how the records were kept, and she discovered sometimes the death date that is ascribed to the man could only be a guess. You find a paratrooper in France later in June. Did he die on D-Day? Did he die earlier? Or later rather. It's hard to say. Sometimes they would simply put down the date that the body was recovered rather than try to guess a death date. Also, many men were missing. Their bodies were never recovered. They were part of an air crew where their bodies were simply incinerated. They were men lost at sea. And so, again, they were listed as missing in action. Carol discovered that when a man was missing in action, very often, but not always, he would be declared dead a year and a day later. So she learned also to look for the date June 7th, 1945 in the records and kind of evaluate whether that person was indeed had died on D-Day. It was a challenging job, and she persevered. She kept going. The unit rosters were certainly, an important source, and also the morning reports that I mentioned before. A morning report is a report typically on the company level in the Army, and it's a daily accounting of the men who are in that unit and still, in fighting form. And one of the reasons for these morning reports was so the Army would know how many rations to send to that unit. But they proved to be a great record because they will list who was missing, who was wounded. They would list promotions sometimes, but they would, most importantly for Carol, list fatalities. Morning reports are written often after the fact, and so it's in days and weeks after D-Day that she begins finding in the morning reports of D-Day units the names of men who had fallen. And for airmen, I mentioned the MACRs, missing air crew reports, and they were absolutely essential in identifying those men who died in the Army Air Forces. So another source you had to peruse were POW records because some men had been taken prisoner but died soon afterwards. For instance, a wounded man who was taken by the Germans but does not survive D-Day, his name might appear in a German report that she had to find and peruse. All of these were, again, you can get the sense of the complexity of the task that Carol had taken on, but Carol persevered as best she could. Another highly informative source that she discovered she would have to look not exhaustively, but heavily, certainly, were records called Individual Deceased Personnel Files, IDPFs. They are not service records. If you know anything about World War II research, you probably know that service records, especially for the Army, were largely destroyed for World War II in a fire at a records repository in St. Louis in 1973. And so almost all of the service records of soldiers are gone, but the IDPFs were separate. They didn't deal necessarily with a man's service in the military. It dealt with his death and with the disposal of his remains after his death. So there would be burial reports in there. There would be occasionally eyewitness accounts of what this man was. There would, or what had happened to this man. There would be, unit records, obviously, or a record of his unit. There would be obviously a record of the all-important date that Carol was looking for. or at least the best guess as to the all-important date. But also, and very poignantly, there would be correspondence between the military and the family at home. And I say these are poignant, these are almost heartrending to look at, because what you get are, of course, the family being notified, the family being offered the opportunity to bring their loved one home for burial in the United States at government expense, incidentally, and no other nation in World War II did that. That was an American thing to honor our fallen servicemen. There would be the headstone application and a record, if he was brought back to the United States for burial, of exactly how he was transported to what funeral home and what date and such. But there would also be these correspondence, which, as I say, were sometimes absolutely heartrending. One case I ran across in an IDPF was of a paratrooper by the name of Thomas Saccone, or Saccone, again, don't know exactly how he would have pronounced it, but he was from New York City, and he fell on D-Day serving with the 82nd Airborne. Soon after that, and it took weeks, unfortunately, it's not like in the movies where the next day these telegrams are being delivered. It took weeks before the family at home would get any news. But then months and months after that, a year after that, Thomas's mother, Angela Saccone, just refused to believe that he was dead and wrote a stream of letters to military officials asking for more information, for confirmation, and expressing her hope that her son was alive somewhere. Here's what she said in one of her letters: "I have no definite proof that my son was killed. I wasn't told if his body was found, if he was buried properly, and also I have not gotten any of his personal belongings. I haven't received anything giving me definite proof. In fact, as a mother, I do not believe my son is dead." She was not alone. There are many of those letters, usually from moms, occasionally from a wife, um, in these IDPFs, where they're clinging as best they can to the last vestige of hope that maybe it's all a big mistake. Usual, uh, kind of the hope that they're grasping to is a case of amnesia. My son is alive. He's in a hospital somewhere. No one's identified him. He doesn't remember who he is. And I, these moms are hoping that suddenly they'll get notice that Tom is still alive and he suddenly has remembered who he was. The sad thing is that didn't happen. That first of all, that's a Hollywood interpretation of the condition of amnesia. It doesn't happen that way. If a soldier did actually, maybe he was so wounded that he's unconscious and he couldn't be identified and they had no dog tags, they have fingerprints, they have dental records, they have his colleagues in the unit. It was just unheard of for a man to be languishing in a hospital and no one knows who he is. It just didn't happen as much as the moms wanted it to. So these letters, again, they're often very poignant, but they speak to a fact I think we always have to remember when we look at these names on the wall. For every name that's on our wall, there's a mom, a dad, a husband, a sister, a brother, children at home who are mourning their loss, and sometimes even in open denial about the loss. And that's also the cost of D-Day, not just the names on the wall, but the names left behind as well. So Carol persevered. She kept going forward. Mainly her Carol, occasionally some research volunteers and some other staff members of the foundation, just kept pouring through these records, found endless complications. Military records, often names were misspelled, or it was a microfilm copy of a typed carbon copy of a record where the name was smudged or the date was smudged, and she had to try to interpret that. Men have the same name often. Even men in the same unit can easily have the same name if it's a common name. Um, and Worst of all was that the dates were often confused, and everything about Carroll's project hinged on that all important date of June 6th, 1944. So she found, as I say, endless complications. But I also want to hasten to add the military Army Graves registration, especially, and the Navy equivalent. They did as good a job as they could in the chaos of war. I often remind people that the goal here is to win the war, not to keep records that keep us historians happy 80 years later. And they did a very good job. Their priority wasn't necessarily the date. They are as accurate as they can be, but their priority is really to notify the survivors at home in as timely a fashion as they could, which again is going to be weeks in World War II. It was less important very often to say exactly what day it happened if they knew. Then again, they did the best job they could. They were accurate probably 98% of the time, but occasionally it was just guesswork or a typo. I mean, how easy is it to do typos, especially in the era before word processing and such. And these dates often got confused. For instance, the naval beach battalions, Navy sailors who land on the beaches of Normandy in the American Navy, with the job of keeping the beach clear and moving the invasion forward. They lost a lot of men. Very often, the Naval Beach Battalion records indicate the date June 8th. And we know, because we've run across cases where we know this man died on June 6th, or eyewitnesses, but the records say June 8th. Why did that many men from the Naval Beach Battalions die on June 8th? Or did some clerk just use that date for convenience purposes because he couldn't know otherwise? I don't know when this man died. Today is the 8th. I'm typing up that date. We don't know, but it leads to questions. How many of those men actually died on D-Day? Some of them we've been able to confirm and their names are on the wall. Others we haven't. And maybe their names should be on the wall, and maybe we'll never know because, as I say, it's just a very difficult proposition. So the research went on, and another complication that Carroll kept running into is the fact that not everyone who died on June 6th, 1944, died in Normandy. Men died on plenty of other battlefields that day, as well as she had to learn to discount a man who died on June 6, 1944, is buried in a military cemetery somewhere. But look at his age. He obviously wasn't a World War II veteran. He might have been a Spanish-American War veteran and just happened to die that day. She had to figure those names out as well and consider them. But often that was harder than it looked. And so through the years, names have been mistakenly added to our wall, usually men who died on June 6th, but not in Normandy. Occasionally men who died in Normandy, but not on June 6th. And one case, in fact, the first one I had to deal with a few years ago was a New York airman by the name of Edwin Boma. And he was listed on our necrology wall and in our roster, because the wall just has names. We have also a roster that the database that captures the other pertinent information, serial numbers, ranks, units, all this sort of thing. And Edward Boma's name was listed because he did die on June 6, 1944. But in further research, we discovered a few years ago that he died in the Adriatic on an air mission coming back from a mission to bomb the German oil fields at Ploiești, Romania, which was an interesting story in itself, but story for another day. And so when we realized that, and it's happened a few other times, those names are taken off the wall and we give them a gold star brick at our memorial, so they're still recognized, because obviously they're still heroes who made a great sacrifice. But the wall, the names on the wall, are different purposes, and so men like Boma are their names are occasionally removed. And meanwhile, as we'll talk about in a minute, we occasionally add some. Let me mention, though, before I get to that, that if combing through that miasma of confusing American records was hard enough, Carol had also been given the job of identifying the Allied fallen. So she had to look at the other 11 nations that contributed soldiers, sailors, airmen to the invasion and consider how many from those nations had fallen. Now, for some of those, it was fairly easy. Britain actually had pretty good records, and she was able to make contact with British officials to get those names. Same thing with Canada, and other nations usually lost less. The United States lost more men than anyone else on D-Day, followed by Britain, followed by Canada. So those three were difficult because there were so many names, but fairly easy because the records were precise and in English. That was another challenge. Some of these were in foreign languages, but other nations lost men as well. Australia, France, New Zealand, Belgium, Norway, all these troops, all these nations lost soldiers or sailors as well. Four nations, Poland, Greece, Czechoslovakia, and Holland, contributed to the invasion, but didn't lose a man that we've identified so far. So the other nations were her main concern. She turned to naval attache or military attaches, various embassies to supply the names. And as I say, it was fairly easy for Britain and Canada. Norway was also fairly easy. They very willingly provided Carol with a list of sailors who had been killed aboard the Norwegian ship Svenner that went down on D-Day, as well as a few Norwegian pilots who died on D-Day. And I hasten to point that out, one, because remember, Norway is also an occupied nation. They know why they're fighting this battle as well. They're liberating France so that tomorrow they can liberate Norway. But also because, and this surprises a lot of people, I've already said, United States is first in the number of fatalities, Britain second, Canada third, fourth is Norway, largely because of the Svenner. So that had to be done. France was a little more challenging, and ironically, not a lot of French soldiers were killed on D-Day. A few were part of a commando unit that was attached to one of the British divisions at Sword Beach. But the French embassy made a request of Carol that made perfect sense, and that was, we want to include in the name of D-Day fallen enlisted French soldiers who were in the French forces of the interior, the organized resistance, not a civilian resistor, but a military resistance, who had died on D-Day, very often shot by the Germans when the invasion started. They were brought out of their cell and shot by the Germans, maybe never knowing that the invasion was underway. And France asked that their names be included as well, and they are. Those names are on our wall alongside all the others. So all this was some of the challenges that Carol faced in the initial research of the Necrology project. I've missed a few slides here. I keep forgetting to flip. There's the wall. We'll get to those guys in a minute. Well, let's go back and talk about these guys, actually, because this is something I kind of read. I've always been interested in lists of names and the variety that comes in it, whether it's just the phone book or a list of names like our Necrology or a roster of a class I was teaching. I've always been kind of interested in how that list of names, what it shows. And there's some interesting aspects about the Necrology of the National D-Day Memorial that says a lot about the American war effort and the American population at the time. For one thing, it's very multinational. Although these are American servicemen, you see Italian names, you see Polish, Hispanic, Czech names, Russian names, Jewish names, Irish names. We know of 6 African Americans whose names are on the wall. We know of several Native Americans. We know of at least one Asian American. And I say at least for all of this because you can't always tell by the last name. For instance, a man might have his father's or his stepfather's, in some cases, last name that doesn't really say his family heritage. But at any rate, all of these, the American melting pot is really revealed by our necrology wall. And then there's some other odd little quirks to the necrology. There is one general on the wall, Don Pratt. There are 2 Medal of Honor recipients, the 2 that you see right here, Jimmy Monteith from Virginia, John Pinder. There were 4 Medal of Honor recipients, but these are the 2 who fell on D-Day itself, and they are on our wall. And then, like I say, just some other quirks. If you go through all of the records, you find a private named captain, a lieutenant named sergeant, a tech sergeant named major, a Navy coxswain named general, and if you count it all up, there are 56 Smiths between the United States, Britain, and Canada. So it's an interesting list in a lot of ways. But back to the question of what next? Well, the answer to that is very simply, we're still working. Here is the current names or current numbers based on the nation. United States lost 2,502 known, and again, that's the best guess we have right now. 1,449 for Britain, 391 for Canada, 38 for Norway. France lost 19, including those men in the resistance I mentioned. Australia, 13, and New Zealand, 2, which, stop and think about that. That says a lot about the war effort as well. Australia and New Zealand are a long way from France, and yet they are sending their sons over there for this fight as well. And then finally, Belgium lost a single pilot on D-Day as well. So those are the current losses, but I hasten to add that's the current losses and counting, because we are still researching and likely will never be finished with the necrology project. And so this year, for the 80th anniversary, I can say these numbers will be changing. I cannot say yet, and I know George here especially is kind of, stomping his feet over it, and a lot of our volunteers are. We're not ready to release the new numbers and the new names yet. That's part of the publicity for the 80th anniversary. Part of this talk today was a stay tuned and be ready for some new names that are coming. But I can say we have found other names that need to be honored on our wall, and those new numbers will be announced closer to D-Day itself. But why are we changing the numbers? Because we continue researching. One thing is, and this I think is says another way to pay tribute to the great work that Carol did back at the beginning. She did it without the internet that we had. Now, in the early 2000s, there wasn't internet. She could find online sources, but the internet is 70 billion times bigger than it was in her days. There are records that are available that weren't. She had to travel cross country in many cases to look for records that we can just get with a few mouse clicks. And especially the men who are buried here, who were brought back from France and buried in the United States in a church cemetery, a family cemetery, whatever. Once that happened, the military, they kind of fell off the military's radar. So those had to be researched. And one source that Carol didn't have that we do today is Find a Grave. There is a wealth of information at Find a Grave. You have to use it carefully because it's, kind of submitted by people researching, and you might want to check your facts and make sure they didn't have a typo or something in there as well. But it's a great source for checking a lot of these names and burial places. That's another thing we track, is where these people are buried. So, and it doesn't show up on the wall, but that is in the database on our app and on our webpage. So you can look up a D-Day fatality. And if we know, there's still many of them that we don't know, but if we know where he's buried, that will be recorded as well. So that project still goes on as we look at other sources. Also, people contact us constantly saying, what about Uncle Frank? Shouldn't he be on the wall? Usually the answer is, I'm sorry, I've looked at the records, and your Uncle Frank certainly died a hero's death in France, but it was on June 20th, 1944, not June 6th. So he's not eligible for our wall. But we get those questions all the time, but occasionally we get one that says, this might well be one we have to research further and maybe add to the wall as soon as we can confirm everything and get all the information that we need. So we are still going through records. We are looking at very often smaller units like an engineer company or men from the 2nd Division who were in some cases volunteered for service on D-Day with an engineer company. And that was easy to miss because you don't think of the 2nd Division as one of the D-Day divisions, but there were a few. The 90th Division was another case where one regiment from the 90th Division was sent over to Utah Beach, I believe it was. And we look at quartermaster units and the Navy and the Coast Guard, because they also lost men. We are going to start a project where we dig a little more deeper into losses with the airmen, because we're kind of guessing, maybe we're wrong, but we're kind of guessing that some names have been missed who took off for the battle but never made it to France to drop their bombs. They were lost in England or over the English Channel. If their plane went down in France, we probably have a record of it, but we may not if they didn't get that far. We're going to look into that in I don't know when I have time, coming years maybe, but we're going to look into those subjects. In other words, the numbers are changing. The numbers will continue to change because the records are sometimes contradictory. I have one case in my files, a man, I was IDPF, and it lists 4 different death dates for him. Which one's correct? I don't know yet. We're going to keep looking. We're going to see if we can figure that out. But they are, the records are, as I say, contradictory in some cases, confusing in others, just incorrect in some cases because it's so easy to list the wrong date. Just typewriter keys are close to each other, and so we're gonna keep looking at that. Expect these numbers to change even more as we go. Sorry about that. So we'll keep you posted on that. And as I say, I don't know that there will ever be a day when we say, finally, we're done. We may never be finished. We may always have to consider another name, whether they should be there. But we will continue to honor the men who fell on D-Day. I always am quick to point out these, right now, 4,415 names on our wall. They're not the beginning and the end of heroism and sacrifice. Their valor, fidelity, and sacrifice certainly deserves to be remembered at the National D-Day Memorial, but men died on June 7th, men died on June 8th, men died in the Pacific, men died in later wars, and a man who fell on D-Day is not necessarily more heroic than a man who died at Okinawa or at Incheon or at Da Nang or at Fallujah. more recently. They all deserve to be remembered, but our job is to identify the fallen from D-Day. And we will continue researching it until we have better answers, even if we're never going to have a final perfect answer. So I will hold it there and take any questions that, if you're watching online, you can submit whichever platform you're using, YouTube, Facebook, the Q&A feature, or the chat feature, and any from the folks in here. So, yes, sir.
In terms of grade preservation people, coming ashore and identifying the remains or finding remains, are there some that were unknown because they, lost the dog tags or their bodies were so deteriorated or whatever, they could not identify them, and you say they washed up on June the 8th.
Right, or sometimes later.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so I presume that some of these are buried as unknown.
They are.
And the question is, are any of those unknowns now being exhumed with DNA, like the punch bowl in the
right.
Oklahoma battleship remains are being disinterred and identified? So
yes, absolutely.
The question is, do we have the remains that we're trying to identify?
Absolutely. And now let me repeat the question for people online, because I don't know how well the my little microphone might have worked for you, but he's asking about efforts to identify the unknown from Normandy, and the answer is yes, they are. You're working on that right now, and expect great things in the future because the technology is only going to get better. There's an agency called the Defense POWMIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, that is working to identify unidentified servicemen from whatever conflict. And you are correct, they're working very heavily on the Oklahoma and soldiers in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii, the cemetery there, for World War II battles in the Pacific Theater, but also Korea and Vietnam to an extent. But in Normandy, absolutely, they are working on that, and they will keep going until they have, again, maybe never a final answer, but the best answer they can get. So yes, absolutely. I already know of several cases where unknowns have been found, exhumed, DNA testing done on their remains, and are now under one of the crosses in Normandy American Cemetery with their name, as opposed to "Here lies a soldier known but to God." So that is a very interesting project. Look into that. It's ongoing, and it will keep ongoing. It's just amazing what they can do. That's the kind of thing no one could dream of in 1944. Kind of thing that Carroll never really thought possible back in 2001. So it's very interesting. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What if somebody gets drowned, but they can't find the body? It's just he's missing in action, but maybe they wouldn't even know who he was.
As a rule, the question is, what about a man who's lost at sea and no body is ever found? That was very common. If you go to the Normandy American Cemetery, there are the tablets of the missing, and many of those are men who were lost at sea, in some cases buried at sea. So they knew this was, but his burial is not in the cemetery. So he is on the walls of the missing as well. And what happens, it's if by some strange fluke a man was on one of the ships and hit by fire and lost in the channel and no one ever knew he was on that ship, obviously we still wouldn't know. But I don't think that's what happened with most of these guys. they knew, um, Seaman First Class John Smith over here was hit by fire, he fell overboard. His body has not been recovered, but we know he's dead because his body hasn't been recovered. So he is, it's probably a service for him. His name is on the walls of the missing. And if no remains are ever recovered, and after a while, obviously in salt water, there comes a point where no remains are ever going to be recovered. Then obviously they can't do DNA testing. So he will always remain missing. And there's always going to be a lot of those, especially at sea. So Navy losses, submarine losses, because submarine losses, very often we don't know where the submarine is. And it's too deep to even look for human remains. And after 80 years, they're probably not going to find anything that's testable. So, there's always going to be more names, unknown, that we know Joe Smith died in the war, and maybe he's in this cemetery, maybe he's lost at sea, but we may never know any more than that. Barring who knows what kind of technology exists, 10 years from now, that might that we can't imagine. But it's a very interesting project that's continuing to go on, and many still MIA. Things have gotten better, incidentally. I don't know if you've ever noticed. Go to Arlington National Cemetery, and those tombs of the unknown. There is no unknown for Vietnam anymore. Why? Because they identified them. There is no unknown for Desert Storm. Why? Because we did a much better job with the technology that existed in the 1990s of keeping up with who is where, who's lost, and being able to identify them. So the idea of an unknown soldier is, I don't want to say a relic of the past, but right now it's certainly not as common as it was in World War II or World War One, of course. Yes, sir.
How about all the equipment on the seafloor in front of the beaches that they calm down? Everyone goes like tanks and jeeps and boats. Maybe they know that people were assigned to that particular piece of equipment, and they tried that.
In some cases, yes, and some of that was done soon after D-Day, as they were, divers would go down to try to recover remains. Sometimes, and those are some of the unknowns. There was a sailor from Minnesota. I can't remember the name of the town, named John Anderson, and his name's on the wall as well. But he's one that was identified by DNA. So his body was recovered soon after D-Day, but he couldn't be identified at that time. It could later on. So yes, a lot of that was done. I don't know how much of that is done or can be done today, because I'm certainly not an expert on mitochondrial DNA, and it's how long it exists in salt water. I think if they tried to raise, say, an aircraft that fell in the Channel or fell in the Pacific, for that matter, I don't know if they would get DNA from that. But there again, who knows what the technology will allow years from now. Anyone else have a question? Anything coming online? Well, want to thank you for joining me, whether in person here in our Education Quonset or online, for this discussion, and invite you to keep watching our news releases, our Facebook page, as we get closer to the 80th anniversary and releasing these new names and numbers for June 6th this year. And I invite you again to come by the memorial this spring and enjoy it, because it's just a spectacular time to be outdoors in Bedford, Virginia. But on behalf of the National D-Day Memorial, staff, board, volunteers, I'm John Long, and appreciate you joining us.